The roads disappear beneath the snow long before midnight. Inside Raven's Rest, the fires are lit, the tea is poured, and the guests settle in for what should have been an ordinary Highland evening. Then a solicitor is found murdered in the library, and every person in the inn has something they would rather leave buried. As the storm deepens, a quiet guest begins to uncover the truth, not through brilliant theatrics, but through patient observation, careful thought, and the ordinary rhythms of an inn that refuses to surrender its warmth, even in the shadow of murder. A classic Golden Age mystery filled with snowbound suspense, fair play clues, unforgettable characters, and the timeless comfort of a Highland inn. By the time the motorcar began its final climb into the Highlands, the afternoon had narrowed to a pale strip of light between the white earth and the lowering sky. Snow had been falling since Perth. At first it had come in loose, indecisive flakes, which dissolved against the windscreen almost as soon as they touched it. Farther north, it had thickened. The road now passed between dark ranks of pine, and the snow moved through their branches in long, slanting veils. From time to time, the driver leaned forward over the wheel, peering into the whiteness as though the road were a sentence written in a language he had only lately begun to understand. I had left London with no purpose more demanding than rest. A fortnight of small obligations had accumulated into the sort of weariness which is not cured by sleep alone. One requires distance for that, not merely the distance measured by railway timetables, but the deeper separation produced by strange rooms, unfamiliar clocks, and the temporary absence of people who know precisely where to find one. Raven's Rest had been recommended to me by an old acquaintance who described it as comfortable, remote, and almost aggressively peaceful. At that moment, the first two qualities appeared beyond dispute. The third remained to be tested. "We shall make it," the driver said, though his tone suggested that the assurance was intended chiefly for himself. "I have every confidence in you." He glanced at me in the mirror. "You may be the only man in Scotland who has." The remark was delivered so gravely that I did not immediately recognize it as humor. When I did, the driver had already returned his attention to the road. We rounded a shoulder of the hill, and Raven's Rest appeared through the snow. It stood upon a low rise above the road, a broad house of grey stone with steep roofs and tall chimneys. Its windows shone amber against the early darkness. Snow lay upon the slates and gathered along the deep eaves. Behind the inn, the pine forest climbed into the white obscurity of the hills. Before it, a short drive curved between stone posts half buried in drifts. A carved raven watched over the entrance from a shallow arch of stone. The motorcar labored up the drive, its tires slipping once before finding purchase. Almost at once, the front door opened, and a man came down the steps without waiting for the car to stop. He was in his early 30s, tall and spare, with dark hair brushed carefully back from a face made more striking by concentration than by regularity. He wore no coat, only a well-cut brown suit beneath a heavy sleeveless cardigan, as though he had stepped outside for a moment and expected the weather to respect the arrangement. "Raven's Rest," he said, opening my door. "You must be frozen." "Not quite, though I should prefer not to conduct the experiment further." A quick smile altered his expression. "I'm Callum Macri. My aunt owns the inn. Let us get you indoors before the road decides to keep you." He took my smaller case and called over his shoulder. A broad-shouldered man in a dark waistcoat appeared from the doorway and went at once to the luggage strapped behind the car. "That is Angus Fraser," Callum said. "Porter, barman, and rescuer of stranded motorists when the occasion requires it." Angus gave a short nod. "Mostly the motorists require rescuing from themselves." The driver muttered something which the wind mercifully carried away. I followed Callum up the steps. As he reached for the door, a ring of keys moved against his palm. One was longer than the others and ended in a square brass bit, polished at its edges by frequent use. He selected another key, turned it in the outer lock, and held the door while I entered. The vestibule was stone-floored and pleasantly overheated. Coats hung from brass pegs along one wall. Beneath them stood a polished wooden rack containing walking boots and several pairs of black rubber overshoes. Each pair was alike, apart from size, and bore a small raven molded into the heel. Snow melted from my shoes onto the mat. "Those overshoes are at the disposal of the guests," Callum said, seeing my glance. "They are not elegant, but elegance has never yet prevented a broken ankle. I have generally found that it encourages one." This earned another brief smile. The inner door opened upon a central hall, paneled in dark oak. A broad staircase rose beneath a stained glass window, now dimmed to muted reds and greens by the snow outside. A grandfather clock stood near the reception desk, its slow ticking audible beneath the murmur of the wind. The warmth had a settled quality. It seemed not merely produced by fires and pipes, but retained by the wood, the carpet, and the thick walls themselves. Somewhere beyond the hall, a log shifted in a grate. The air carried the faint sense of beeswax, peat smoke, and tea. A woman came from a doorway near the foot of the stairs. She was perhaps 60, upright and silver-haired, with a composed face in which kindness had not entirely concealed fatigue. "You have arrived," she said. "I had begun to fear the snow would turn you back." "Mrs. Macri. Elena Macri. Welcome to Raven's Rest." Her hand was cool and firm. She looked past me as Angus brought in the luggage. "Callum, has the rear service door been secured?" I was about to see to it. "Do so before the drift reaches the step. Mrs. Kaya says the latch has been troublesome again." Callum slipped his fingers through the key ring. The long square-ended key flashed once beneath the hall lamp. "I had it filed yesterday. It will hold." He went along the passage beside the reception desk and disappeared through a green baize door. Mrs. Macri watched him go with an expression difficult to read. It contained affection, certainly, but also the habitual concern of one who has entrusted another person with responsibilities and cannot quite prevent herself from carrying them as well. "The weather has come earlier than we expected," she said. "But you are safe inside now. Tea is waiting in the drawing room whenever you are ready." She opened the door of a small office behind the desk and took a room register from a shelf. The room was modest and orderly, with a roll-top desk, pigeonholes, and 2 substantial account books arranged beneath the window. On the wall hung a shallow glazed press containing labeled keys. One labeled "Red Rear Service Door." A square brass key hung beneath it on a red cord. Mrs. Macri saw that I had noticed it. "The spare," she said. "Callum carries the one in daily use. I prefer to know where the other is during weather such as this. A sensible precaution. Winter rewards sensible precautions. It punishes nearly everything else." She entered my name in the register and selected a key from a drawer. As she did so, Callum returned through the baize door. "Fastened," he said. The snow is already banking against the yard wall. He had removed his cardigan and carried it folded across one arm. His shirt cuffs were visible beneath his jacket. Each was secured by a small carved cufflink made from pale antler, fashioned in the shape of a thistle head and mounted in silver. They were unusually distinctive, though not ostentatious. "Angus will take you up," Mrs. Macri said. "Your room overlooks the Western Road. It is one of our quieter rooms, though I cannot promise much of a view tonight." Angus lifted both cases as though they contained linen rather than books. I followed him upstairs. My room was long and comfortable, with a narrow canopied bed, a writing desk, a deep armchair, and a small fire burning behind a brass guard. Heavy curtains had been left open. Beyond the glass, the evening had nearly vanished. Angus placed the cases beside the wardrobe. "Hot water is on its way. Dinner at 7:30. Tea downstairs before then." "Thank you." He hesitated near the door. "The road may be closed by 6. So the driver believed. Lies. He has the expression of a man who has just discovered that nature does not consult a timetable. When he had gone, I stood before the window. The motor car was already turning at the end of the drive. Its lamps glowed dimly through the snow, then slipped between the stone posts and disappeared among the pines. For several minutes, I could still distinguish the road as a grey line descending through the trees. Then the snowfall thickened, the last of the daylight withdrew, and the road vanished altogether. A knock sounded at the door a few minutes later, followed by the arrival of hot water in a broad copper can and the information that tea had just been replenished downstairs. I changed my traveling coat for a dark jacket, washed away the last chill of the journey, and went down. The drawing room lay to the west of the hall. It was a long, gracious room with 2 tall windows, now thickly curtained, and a fireplace large enough to accommodate a respectable portion of the pine forest outside. 2 leather chairs stood nearest the hearth. Farther back were a sofa, a card table, a closed piano, and several smaller chairs arranged with the appearance of accident that generally requires considerable forethought. A silver tea service waited upon a low table. Mrs. Macri stood beside it, pouring for a gentleman whose military bearing had survived both retirement and a noticeable increase in girth. He rose as I entered. "Major Hugh Fenwick," Mrs. Macri said. "One of our most loyal winter guests." "Loyalty is a generous word," the Major replied. "I have reached an age at which I return chiefly to places where the chairs have already learned my shape." His voice was deep and agreeable. His grey moustache was clipped with precision, and his tweed jacket appeared to have been cut for a slimmer man in a more optimistic period of his life. I accepted his hand. "You have chosen a dramatic afternoon for your arrival," he said. I was assured the Highlands would be peaceful. They aren't. It is merely that Highland peace occasionally arrives with sufficient force to bury a motor car. Mrs. Macri handed me tea. Callum says the lower road is still passable. Callum, said the Major, lowering himself carefully into his chair, has the distressing habit of considering a road passable so long as some portion of it remains visible. Near the second window, a woman had been reading beneath a shaded lamp. She closed her book and came toward us. She was in her middle 40s, with clear grey eyes, dark hair touched lightly with silver, and the composed manner of someone accustomed to being obeyed without ever appearing to demand it. Dr. Beatrice Lennox, Mrs. Macri said. She arrived yesterday. Dr. Lennox inclined her head. I had intended to leave tomorrow, she said. The weather appears to have formed a different medical opinion. You are fortunate to have a doctor in the house, I observed. That depends entirely upon whether anyone intends to become ill. The Major raised his cup. I never become ill in Scotland. I reserve that for London, where it is more readily appreciated. Dr. Lennox returned to her chair, though not to her book. Her attention rested briefly upon the windows when a stronger gust pressed snow against the glass with a dry whisper. The drawing room possessed that particular comfort found only in places where winter has been taken seriously. The curtains were heavy enough to exclude every draught. The fire had been built with patience. A brass fender reflected the glow across the carpet, and the tea tasted faintly of smoke and heather. For some time, our conversation remained pleasantly inconsequential. The Major spoke of fishing, though he admitted that he disliked both cold water and early mornings. Dr. Lennox described a village farther north, where she had once attended a patient during a storm. Mrs. Macri asked after my journey and apologized twice for weather over which she had no authority. Callum entered, carrying an armful of split logs. The driver reached the road before the worst of it, he said. Angus saw his lamps beyond the bend. And the higher road, Mrs. Macri asked. Filling quickly. He placed the logs in a copper basket beside the hearth. The keys at his waist gave a faint metallic sound as he straightened. We may be alone tonight. The Major looked toward the fire. There are worse fates. Callum glanced at the mantel clock. 2 guests are still expected. Mrs. Macri's hand paused above the teapot. Mr. Haldane and his secretary. The change in the room was slight, but it was present. The Major lowered his cup without drinking. Dr. Lennox's expression did not alter, though her fingers closed upon the edge of her book. Mrs. Macri set down the teapot with unnecessary care. Are they traveling from Inverness? I asked. From Edinburgh originally, she replied. They remained last night in Pitlochry and telephoned this morning to say they would continue. In this weather, said the Major. Mr. Haldane is not easily discouraged. Dr. Lennox opened her book again. No, she said. He is not. No one expanded upon the remark. At 20 minutes to 6, the sound of a motor horn reached us faintly through the storm. Callum went at once to the hall. Mrs. Macri followed, and the rest of us rose with varying degrees of haste. Through the glass of the front door, 2 yellow lamps emerged between the stone posts. The motor car moved slowly up the drive, snow packed upon its bonnet and running boards. Its engine coughed once before stopping beneath the entrance arch. Angus and Callum went down the steps. The first passenger to enter was a tall, narrow man of about 60. Snow lay upon the shoulders of his black overcoat and silvered the brim of his hat. His face was lean, clean-shaven, and carefully controlled. A pair of rimless spectacles gave greater severity to eyes that required little assistance in that direction. He removed his gloves 1 finger at a time. "Mrs. Macri," he said, "I trust our rooms are ready." "They are, Mr. Haldane." There was no warmth in his greeting, though neither was there discourtesy. He simply spoke as a man who regarded courtesy as an account to be settled exactly and without interest. Behind him came a younger woman carrying a leather dispatch case against her side. She was perhaps 30, plainly but elegantly dressed in a dark traveling suit. Her fair hair was pinned beneath a close-fitting hat, and her expression had the quiet reserve of one who had spent years ensuring that another person's affairs remained in order. Callum reached for the case. "I shall take that, Miss Reed." "No, thank you." Her answer was immediate but not sharp. She adjusted her grip upon the handle. "Mr. Haldane's papers must remain with me." The case was made of red leather, darkened at the corners by use. A narrow brass lock secured its flap. Haldane removed his overcoat and handed it to Angus. "Is the telephone working?" Intermittently, Callum replied. "The snow has affected the line. I shall require it later. We shall do what we can." Haldane's gaze dropped briefly to the keys at Callum's waist. "I hope the rest of the establishment is maintained more reliably." Callum's face remained courteous. "The doors are secure, if that is your concern." "My concerns are seldom limited to doors." Mrs. Macri stepped between them with the ease of someone accustomed to preventing small unpleasantness from taking root. "Come into the drawing room. You must both be cold." Haldane greeted the Major with a short inclination of the head. "Fenwick." "Haldane." Neither man offered his hand. When Dr. Lennox's name was spoken, Haldane looked at her for a moment longer. "Doctor." "Mr. Haldane." Her voice was level. The title sounded less like a greeting than the acknowledgement of an entry in a register. Isabel Reed accepted tea, but did not remove the red case from beside her chair. She spoke little. When Haldane asked for a document concerning the road conditions, she opened the case, found a folded sheet without hesitation, and handed it to him. He glanced over it and returned it. "Thank you, Miss Reed." She replaced it in precisely the same position. By 6 o'clock, the light outside had disappeared completely. The windows, though curtained, seemed to hold the cold behind them. From the hall came the slow striking of the clock. 6 measured notes. A moment later, Angus entered. "The road is gone above the bridge," he said. "A lorry has stopped below the lower bend. They will not move it tonight." Mrs. Macri looked toward Haldane. Then no one else will be joining us. And no one will be leaving, said the Major. Haldane folded his hands over one knee. A temporary inconvenience. Outside, the wind moved along the eaves. Snow brushed against the panes and settled into the silence beyond them. Within the drawing room, the lamps glowed warmly, the fire burned steadily, and Angus carried away the empty cups. Haldane watched Mrs. Macri as she rose to speak with Callum near the door. Before dinner, he said, I should like a word concerning Raven's Rest. Mrs. Macri turned. Of course. And afterward, if you please, I shall require the principal ledger. The announcement concerning the ledger was followed by a silence too brief to be called awkward, yet sufficiently distinct to alter the temper of the room. Mrs. Macri answered with composure. Callum will see that it is ready. Haldane inclined his head, as though acknowledging the fulfillment of an obligation already overdue. The party began to disperse shortly afterward. Major Fenwick went upstairs to dress for dinner, complaining amiably that Highland Inns expected a degree of formality from men whom the weather had rendered philosophical. Dr. Lennox followed at a more measured pace. Isabel Reed accompanied Haldane to the east corridor, still carrying the red case. Mrs. Macri remained near the drawing-room fire. I hope Mr. Haldane's manner has not made your first evening uncomfortable, she said. Not at all. He has a severe way of speaking. So do many men who charge for their time. A faint smile appeared and vanished. He has advised my family for a great many years. There are relationships which survive not because affection sustains them, but because habit has become indistinguishable from necessity. Mrs. Macri's tone suggested that her association with Malcolm Haldane belonged to that class. Callum entered from the hall. The telephone has gone altogether, he said. Angus reached the exchange for half a minute, then the line failed. Can it be repaired? Not tonight. He looked toward his aunt. I have checked the east windows and the kitchen yard. Everything is secure. Mrs. Macri thanked him, though her gaze rested upon him a moment longer than the words required. I went upstairs to change. My room had grown warmer. The fire had settled into a red, steady glow, and the snow beyond the glass reflected enough light from the house to soften the darkness immediately beneath the window. Nothing could be seen of the road. At 7:30, the grandfather clock summoned us to dinner. The dining room lay behind the central hall. It was less grand than the drawing room, but more intimate, with dark oak walls, a long table laid for 7, and a fire burning beneath a carved stone mantel. 2 silver candelabra stood among low arrangements of holly and winter greenery. Their flames trembled whenever the wind found some narrow imperfection in the windows. Mrs. Macri sat at one end of the table and Haldane at the other. I was placed between Dr. Lennox and Major Fenwick. Callum sat beside his aunt, opposite Isabel Reed. The meal began with a clear broth fragrant with herbs. It was followed by roast grouse, potatoes browned in butter, and winter vegetables from the inn's cellar. Mrs. Kaya, whom I had not yet met, sent forth food of a quality, suggesting that isolation had sharpened rather than limited her ambitions. For a time, the conversation remained general. The Major described a stalking expedition from his youth in which he had followed the wrong guide for 3 miles before discovering that the man was not a guide at all, but a postman returning home. "You said nothing," Dr. Lennox asked. "I was 24. At 24, a man will endure almost any inconvenience rather than admit he has misunderstood the situation. And at 60, he relates it at dinner and claims it as experience." Even Haldane permitted himself the suggestion of a smile. Callum spoke little while the servants were in the room. He watched the progress of the meal, occasionally exchanging a quiet word with Angus near the sideboard. His cuffs showed when he reached for the wine. The pale antler cufflinks I had noticed earlier caught the candlelight, each carved into the compact form of a thistle head and fastened with silver. Isabel Reed sat very straight, eating sparingly. A small notebook lay beside her place, though she did not open it at first. It was Haldane who moved the conversation from reminiscence to business. "A difficult season," he said, looking toward Mrs. Macri. "So I understand." "The snow has come early," she replied. "I was referring to the year, not the evening." Callum set down his glass. "Bookings improved in October." "October is not winter." "No, but it contributes to the same accounts." Haldane turned his wineglass by its stem. "Winter expenditure has an unfortunate tendency to arrive before winter income." The words were mild. Callum's face remained unchanged, but the small muscles at his jaw tightened. Mrs. Macri intervened. "The roof repairs could not be postponed." "I do not question the necessity of a sound roof." "Then what do you question?" Callum asked. Haldane looked at him. "The figures beneath it." The fire gave a quiet crack. Somewhere outside, snow slid from an overburdened branch and struck the window with a soft, spreading sound. Isabel opened her notebook. She did so without being instructed. Her pencil moved briefly across the page in compact, angular marks before she closed the cover again. Mrs. Macri noticed. "Is that necessary at dinner, Miss Reed?" Isabel's expression remained composed. "Mr. Haldane asked me to preserve any observations relevant to tomorrow's discussion." "There will be no discussion tomorrow if the road remains closed," said the Major. "Business is not abolished by snow," Haldane replied. "Only postponed by it. Postponement is frequently the beginning of loss." The Major's good humor faded by a degree. "Some debts are settled more slowly than others. Not when the terms are properly understood." Their eyes met across the table. Haldane continued, "You received my letter, Fenwick." "I receive a great many letters. Mine generally require answers. I had intended to speak with you privately. You may do so after dinner." The Major lifted his glass but did not drink. Mrs. Macri asked Angus to bring the next course. The interruption restored conversation, though not ease. A steamed pudding arrived with cream, and for several minutes, our attention was directed toward matters less capable of resentment. Dr. Lennox had remained silent during the exchange. Haldane now turned to her. "You are still practicing in Edinburgh." when required. I had heard you had reduced your work. You hear a great deal. It is my profession to be informed. Your profession is the law. The distinction is smaller than you suppose. Dr. Lennox laid down her spoon. My late husband believed that too. The remark passed quietly across the candles. Haldane's expression cooled. Your husband's judgment was not always reliable. No, she said, particularly where you were concerned. Mrs. Macri moved slightly in her chair. Beatrice. There is no need, Elena. Mr. Haldane and I have long since exhausted the subject. I had hoped so, Haldane said. Dr. Lennox looked at him with complete steadiness. Hope was never the difficulty. No one spoke for several moments. It was not anger that disturbed me. Anger is often noisy and therefore easier to measure. What lay between them had the stillness of something preserved. Coffee was served in the dining room rather than the drawing room. The wind had strengthened, though the sound reached us only as a low movement behind the walls. The windows reflected the table, the candle flames, and our own faces suspended against darkness. Haldane asked Isabel for her notebook. She handed it across. He read the shorthand entries, corrected one word with her pencil, and returned it. Callum watched him. You spoke of signatures earlier, he said. Was that intended to mean something? Haldane folded his napkin. Signatures always mean something. Not every error is fraud. I did not use the word fraud. You allowed it to sit at the table. Haldane's gaze did not leave him. Explanations are useful, Mr. Macri. Signatures are evidence. Mrs. Macri's hand tightened around the handle of her coffee cup. What signature? That is one of the matters the ledger may clarify. Callum leaned back. Both antler cufflinks remained fastened at his wrists, pale against the dark cloth of his sleeves. Mrs. Macri spoke with quiet firmness. This is neither the time nor the place. Haldane glanced toward the mantel clock. It was 25 minutes past 8. Quite so. He rose when Mrs. Macri did, and the rest of us followed. As we passed into the hall, the warmth of the dining room gave way briefly to the cooler air beneath the staircase. Angus crossed toward the east passage, carrying a tray with a decanter, 2 glasses, and a box of matches. For the library, Callum asked. Lies, as you instructed. Callum looked toward Haldane. You mean to work there tonight? I mean to complete what I came to do. The library door stood at the far end of the east passage. Light showed beneath it. The fire had evidently been lit and the room prepared. Haldane took out his watch. At 10 minutes past 9, he said, bring the principal ledger to me in the library. We returned to the drawing room shortly after 8:30. The fire had been replenished in our absence, and the lamps had been lowered to a softer glow. Coffee waited upon the table beside a silver pot of hot water, while a decanter and several glasses had been set near the hearth. Beyond the curtains, the snow continued to move against the windows with a faint, persistent brushing. Mrs. Macri took her usual chair, but did not immediately sit. She stood for a moment with one hand resting upon its back, looking toward the hall as though she had heard something the rest of us had missed. Haldane entered behind her. "Elena," he said, "before you settle yourself." From the inside pocket of his dinner jacket, he removed a long cream envelope. It bore no stamp and had been sealed with dark red wax. Mrs. Macri looked at it without extending her hand. "What is that?" "A matter which should not be delayed further." Callum had paused near the drinks table. His expression sharpened. "Can it not wait until morning?" "No." Haldane held the envelope toward Mrs. Macri. She accepted it at last. The paper seemed very white against her dark dress. "You need not read it here," Haldane said. "How considerate." Her voice remained courteous, but the words had acquired an edge. She crossed the room and stopped beside Callum. "See that our guests have what they require." Then, without opening the envelope, she left by the door leading into the hall. Callum watched her go. "What have you given her?" "That is between Mrs. Macri and myself. She is my aunt. A relationship is not a legal privilege." Callum's hand closed briefly around the decanter stopper. The silver-mounted antler cufflinks remained fastened at both wrists. Major Fenwick moved nearer the fire. "Well," he said, "if we are to spend the evening behaving as though none of this concerns us, I should like a whiskey sufficiently persuasive to assist." Callum poured for him. The Major received the glass, but did not retreat to his chair. Instead, he remained beside Haldane. "You mentioned my letter," he said. "I did. May I have 5 minutes?" Haldane glanced at the clock. "You may have 3. They crossed to the far end of the room, near the closed piano. Neither man lowered his voice enough to suggest secrecy, but the distance and the wind prevented their words from carrying clearly. I heard only fragments. "Temporary difficulty. Already extended twice. Not asking you to forgive it." Terms were explicit. The Major's shoulders seemed to diminish beneath his dinner jacket. Haldane stood very still, one hand resting upon the piano lid. His manner was not aggressive. That would have required emotion. He listened with the patience of a man who had already reached his decision. Dr. Lennox sat beneath the shaded lamp with a cup of coffee untouched beside her. Her book lay open, though her eyes had not moved along the page. "You know Mr. Haldane well?" I asked. "Well enough." That is rarely an enthusiastic answer. Enthusiasm is not always the product of knowledge. Across the room, the Major said, more distinctly, "Another month." Haldane replied, "No." The single word ended the conversation. Major Fenwick returned to the hearth. He drank rather more of the whiskey than its flavor required. Haldane remained by the piano until Dr. Lennox spoke. "You always did possess a remarkable talent for granting time to those who do not need it." He turned, "And withholding it from those who do. From those who have already paid for it." The Major looked from one to the other, but neither appeared aware of him. Haldane approached Dr. Lennox's chair. "If you wish to reopen old matters, Doctor, I should prefer that you do so accurately. I have no wish to reopen them. You have merely taken care that they never closed. Your husband made certain decisions. My husband was ill. He remained legally competent. You ensured that the papers said so." Haldane's face altered very little. "Take care." Dr. Lennox closed her book. "There was a time when that warning might have impressed me." The grandfather clock began its quarter-hour chime in the hall. The slow notes entered the room between them and remained after the last vibration had faded. Haldane inclined his head. "We shall speak no more of it tonight. I had no intention of doing so." He turned away. The restraint of their exchange made it no less personal. There are quarrels which gain force from lowered voices, as though anger, denied the convenience of noise, must find a sharper form. "Callum brought me coffee." "I apologize," he said quietly. "This is not the evening my aunt intended." Evenings seldom consult their hosts. He looked toward the door through which Mrs. Macri had departed. "No." Angus appeared in the hall entrance. "Mr. Macri." Callum joined him near the threshold. They spoke in low voices. The exchange answered once, Angus said. "Then nothing. Did you try the kitchen instrument?" "Lied. Dead there as well." Callum went to the small telephone table beneath the staircase. I could see him lift the receiver and turn the handle several times. He listened, replaced it, and returned. "The line has failed completely," he announced. Haldane took out his watch. "For how long?" "Until someone reaches the break. That will not be tonight." "Unfortunate." "You may use the writing desk in the library." "I had intended to." Isabel Reed had remained near the card table with her notebook beside her. Haldane addressed her without turning fully. "Miss Reed, bring the red case to the library at 20 minutes past 9. "Yes, Mr. Haldane." "You need not remain. I shall call you when I am ready for dictation." "At 9:45. If the meeting has concluded." Callum looked at him. "It will not require 35 minutes. That depends upon the quality of the explanations." Isabel's gaze moved briefly to Callum, then returned to her notebook. Mrs. Macri re-entered the drawing room. The envelope was no longer in her hand. She crossed directly to the fire and stood before it, warming fingers which did not appear cold. "Is anything wrong?" Callum asked. "Nothing which need concern our guests." "It concerns you." She turned toward him. "Later, Callum." He seemed prepared to persist, but something in her expression prevented him. Instead, he poured her coffee and placed the cup upon the table beside her chair. Haldane looked toward the mantel clock. 5 minutes to 9. "Mr. Macri, the ledger." Callum glanced at his aunt. Mrs. Macri did not look up. He left the drawing room and crossed the hall toward the office. The door remained open, allowing me to see him remove one of the substantial account books from beneath the window. He rested it upon the roll-top desk, turned several pages, and then closed it beneath his hand. The keys at his waist shifted as he lifted the volume. The long, square-ended service key lay among them, its brass end briefly catching the hall light. He returned past the drawing-room entrance with the ledger beneath one arm. Both pale antler cufflinks were still in place. The hall clock showed 10 minutes past 9. Callum walked along the east passage, opened the library door, and closed it behind him. For several moments after the library door closed, no one spoke of Callum or of the ledger he had carried away. Raven's Rest resumed, with admirable determination, the ordinary business of an evening. Angus collected the empty coffee cups from the drawing room and carried them through the baize door. A young housemaid entered with a brass coal scuttle, knelt before the hearth, and drew the embers together with practiced care. She was a slight, dark-haired girl whom Mrs. Macri addressed as Mary. The fresh coal settled with a soft crackle, and the fire strengthened slowly rather than flaring, sending a deeper warmth across the carpet. Mrs. Macri thanked her. "There are extra blankets in the East Press, Mary. See that Miss Reed has one." "Yes, ma'am." "And put another hot water bottle in Dr. Lennox's room." Dr. Lennox looked up from her book. "One will be sufficient." "It is not a medical decision," Mrs. Macri said. "It is a Highland one." The doctor accepted the ruling with the faintest inclination of her head. Mary gathered the brush and scuttle. As she passed through the doorway, the quiet domestic sounds of the inn came briefly with her, china being arranged in the pantry, a cupboard closing, the muted exchange of voices from the kitchen passage. Somewhere upstairs, water moved through the pipes with a low metallic murmur. The ordinary rhythm was reassuring. The storm might have erased the road and silenced the telephone, but within Raven's Rest, fires were still tended, beds turned down, and cups washed for morning. Isabel Reed sat at the card table with her notebook open before her. She consulted her wristwatch, closed the book, and reached for the red dispatch case beside her chair. It was 20 minutes past 9. "I shall take this to Mr. Haldane," she said. Mrs. Macri looked toward the hall. "Will you require a lamp?" "No, thank you. The passage is well lit." Isabel lifted the case and left the room. Through the open drawing room door, I saw her cross the hall and enter the east passage. Her steps faded upon the carpet. A few seconds later came the muted sound of the library door opening. Major Fenwick stood near the mantel, examining a framed watercolor of the inn as it had appeared before the western wing was added. "Painted by Alina's father," he said to me. He believed architecture reached perfection sometime before plumbing. Mrs. Macri settled into her chair. He objected only to visible plumbing, a distinction of great importance to a freezing guest. Dr. Lennox turned a page. He objected to central heating until the winter of 1912. "What occurred then?" I asked. "He grew older," Mrs. Macri said. The Major nodded gravely. "A persuasive, modern influence." The small exchange eased something in the room. Mrs. Macri's expression softened, and for the first time since Haldane had handed her the envelope, she appeared to be seated in her own drawing room rather than awaiting judgment in it. Isabel returned almost at once. She carried no dispatch case. "Mr. Haldane will keep the papers," she said. Her voice was even, though she paused before sitting. "Was Callum still with him?" Mrs. Macri asked. "Yes, and all was well." Isabel removed one glove finger by finger, though she had not been outdoors. They were discussing the accounts. That was not precisely an answer, but Mrs. Macri did not press her. The mantel clock showed 22 minutes past 9. Major Fenwick poured himself a little more whiskey. Dr. Lennox resumed her reading. Isabel opened her notebook, but made no entry. I took a volume from the shelf beside my chair. It was an illustrated history of the Western Highlands, printed in Edinburgh some 40 years earlier. The paper had darkened pleasantly at the edges, and the pages carried the faint, dry scent of old libraries. The wind had fallen somewhat. Without it, the snow seemed quieter and more complete. It touched the windows with scarcely any sound at all. From the east side of the inn came nothing. At 9:30, Angus entered with a tray of fresh coffee and a small plate of shortbread. "Mrs. Kerr says no one is to remain awake on an empty stomach," he announced. "A doctrine of which I have always approved," said the Major. Angus placed the tray upon the low table. As he straightened, Callum appeared in the hall. He came from the direction of the baize door rather than the east passage, though the several connecting corridors made that unsurprising. He entered the drawing room at approximately 2 minutes past the half hour. The ledger was no longer with him. Mrs. Macri looked up quickly. "Well?" Callum crossed to the drinks table. Mr. Haldane wished to examine the figures alone. Was he satisfied? He was Mr. Haldane. His tone made the answer seem sufficient. He poured water into a glass and drank it without sitting. There was a narrow, damp line along the lower edge of his right trouser cuff, darkening the cloth above the shoe. Angus noticed it too. "You have been out, Mr. Macri." "No," Callum glanced down. "I brushed against the vestibule mat while checking the door. The guests have brought half the drive in upon their boots." He set down the glass. His left cuff remained secured by its pale antler thistle. On his right wrist, the shirt cuff was fastened only by its button, and the empty eyelet showed briefly when he adjusted his sleeve. Mrs. Macri did not appear to notice. "Did Mr. Haldane say when he would finish?" "He was alive and working when I left him. He said Miss Reed might return at 9:45. Isabel looked at the mantel clock. "Then I shall do so." Callum went to the fire and stood with one hand upon the mantel. In the stronger light, his face seemed paler than it had at dinner, though that might have been the contrast with the dark paneling. The grandfather clock in the hall marked the 1/4 hour. Its notes faded slowly through the inn. Major Fenwick drained his glass and placed it upon the table. "I believe I left my cigarette case in the vestibule." He went out. Mrs. Macri watched the doorway after he had disappeared. "He has not smoked since luncheon," she said. Dr. Lennox looked over the top of her book. Perhaps the case has. No one followed him. He returned several minutes later with the cigarette case in his hand. He did not light one. Instead, he slipped the case into his pocket and sat in the chair farthest from the fire. At 20 minutes to 10, Dr. Lennox closed her book. I have the beginnings of a headache. Mrs. Macri rose slightly. Shall I ask Mary for something? I have powders upstairs. She left by the main staircase. The room settled once more. Callum moved away from the fire and stood beside his aunt's chair. He bent to say something too quietly for me to hear. Mrs. Macri shook her head. Not now, she said. Isabel looked at her watch. It was 9:45. She gathered her notebook and 2 sharpened pencils. Mr. Haldane will be ready for dictation. She crossed the hall and entered the east passage for the second time. The drawing room door remained open behind her. I heard the library latch turn. Then there was silence. A second later came the sharp fall of something small upon wood, followed by Isabel's voice. Not a scream. Merely Haldane's name, spoken once in disbelief. I was already on my feet when she appeared at the end of the passage. Her face had lost all color. Dr. Lennox, she said. Please fetch Dr. Lennox. Callum reached the library before the rest of us. Mrs. Macri followed him, one hand pressed against the back of a chair as she passed. Major Fenwick remained behind for a moment, then came after us more slowly. The library door stood wide. Malcolm Haldane lay upon the carpet beside the desk, one arm folded beneath him and the other extended toward the cold hearthrug. His spectacles had fallen nearby. The red dispatch case rested open upon the desk, and the principal ledger lay beside it. The casement window beyond the curtains was open. Snow had gathered upon the sill. Callum took one step into the room. I caught his arm. Do not touch anything. Dr. Lennox came swiftly along the passage, carrying a small leather case. She knelt beside Haldane, felt for a pulse, and then examined the side of his head without moving him more than was necessary. The room remained very still around her. At last she rose. Malcolm Haldane is dead, she said, and he did not die naturally. For a few moments, no one moved. The fire in the library had burned low, and the draft from the open casement drew a thin current of cold air across the room. It stirred one corner of a paper upon the desk and made the nearest lamp flame lean within its glass chimney. Mrs. Macri was the first to speak. Callum, she said very quietly, closed the window. No, I said. He had already taken a step toward it. He stopped and looked at me. Nothing in this room should be touched until we understand what has happened. The authority with which I spoke surprised no one more than myself. I had come to Raven's Rest with the modest intention of reading, sleeping, and declining every invitation that required polished shoes. Yet old habits possess a persistence of their own. Callum's face tightened. The snow is coming in. It has already come in. A little more will do less harm than a hand upon the latch. Dr. Lennox remained beside the body. He was struck, she said, behind the right ear. Could the fall have caused it? No. She opened her leather case and removed a small electric torch. Shielding the beam with one hand, she examined the wound more closely. The blow was heavy and sharply localized. He may have died almost at once. Approximately when? She looked toward the clock upon the mantel. I should prefer not to pretend to an exactness I do not possess. Within the last half hour, certainly. Perhaps rather less. Isabel stood near the doorway, one hand still holding her notebook. Her other hand rested against the frame, as though the solid oak were required to support her. At 20 minutes past 9, he was alive, she said. I brought the dispatch case. Mr. Macri was here. All eyes turned toward Callum. He did not flinch. I left shortly afterward. Mr. Haldane was alive and working. At what time? I asked. About 9:30. 2 minutes after, Angus said from the passage. Callum glanced at him. You noticed. I brought the coffee at past. You came in after me. The words were offered without accusation. Angus appeared troubled merely by the necessity of speaking them. Mrs. Macri drew herself upright. Isabel, you should sit down. I am quite well. You are not. She took Isabel gently by the arm and led her toward one of the leather chairs near the wall. The gesture was so instinctively hospitable that, for a moment, the room became again part of an inn rather than the scene of a death. Mrs. Macri turned to Mary, who had appeared soundlessly behind Angus. Bring water for Miss Reed. Warm, not cold. And ask Mrs. Kaya to keep the kettle upon the range. Mary's eyes had gone once toward the body and no farther. Yes, ma'am. And bank the drawing room fire. No one is to sit in the cold while we decide what must be done. The girl withdrew. A minute later, beyond the closed library door, I heard the familiar domestic movements of ravens rest continuing under strain. The faint chink of a cup, the soft fall of coal into a scuttle, the baize door opening and closing. Even calamity could not wholly interrupt the inn's long-practiced care for those beneath its roof. I asked Major Fenwick, Mrs. Macri, and Callum to wait in the drawing room. Callum objected at first, saying that the library belonged to the inn and that his aunt should not be excluded from it. Mrs. Macri silenced him with a look. We shall do as we are asked. Isabel remained only long enough to tell me precisely where she had found Haldane. She had entered, spoken his name, and taken 2 steps beyond the threshold before seeing him beside the desk. She had touched nothing. When she had gone, I closed the door. Dr. Lennox and I were alone with the dead man. The library was broad but not large. Bookcases occupied 3 walls, their upper shelves reached by a sliding brass ladder. The desk stood near the east window, angled so that its occupant might look toward the fire or across the terrace. 2 leather chairs faced one another beside a low table on which Angus had earlier placed the decanter and glasses. 1 glass had been used. The other remained clean. The ledger lay open upon the desk. Beside it stood the red dispatch case, its brass lock released, and its contents arranged with an order that suggested Isabel's hand rather than Haldane's. A fountain pen rested uncapped upon a blotter. The telephone receiver remained in its cradle. Nothing appeared overturned. There had been no violent struggle in the ordinary sense. Haldane's spectacles lay perhaps 2 feet from his head. One arm was trapped beneath his body. The other extended toward the hearthrug, the fingers contracted. I knelt beside him. "May I examine the hand?" Dr. Lennox nodded. The fingers were closed tightly around something dark. It required care to remove it. The object was small, no larger than the end joint of my little finger, and slightly curved. One surface was pale beneath a dark smear. Another held a narrow piece of silver metal. I placed it in a clean envelope taken from Haldane's desk. "What is it?" Dr. Lennox asked. "I do not yet know." She looked at the dead man's knuckles. "There is fresh damage here." The skin across 2 fingers had been grazed. Beneath one nail was a faint line of torn fabric or thread, too small to identify in the uncertain light. "He caught at someone," she said. "Or something." I rose and examined the room. The bookcases were orderly, though a pair of bronze raven bookends upon a lower shelf had been placed unevenly. One stood squarely against a row of volumes. The other sat a fraction forward, leaving a narrow gap. I lifted neither. Bending closer, I saw that the nearer raven was cleaner than its companion. Dust remained in the deeper cuts of one, while the other had been wiped across its broad surfaces. Within the recessed pattern of the wing, however, a thin, dark trace remained. Near the beak was a fresh, bright mark in the bronze. One of the green baize pads beneath its base had shifted and showed at the edge. Dr. Lennox joined me. "Could that have made the wound?" "It is possible. More than possible. Possibility is enough for the moment." The fire required attention next. Most of the coal had settled into a dull red bed. A charred sheet had collapsed among the embers, almost entirely consumed. Behind the grate, where the draft had carried it, lay a small blackened corner of paper. I used the fire tongs to retrieve it. A printed number remained visible through the scorching. 47. I placed the fragment beside the envelope containing the object from Haldane's hand. The ledger upon the desk was open near its middle. Its pages had been turned back carelessly, and I could not at once see whether anything had been removed. That question could wait. The window could not. The casement opened outward over the east terrace. Snow had gathered along the inner sill and melted in a shallow line upon the polished wood. One curtain had been drawn partly aside. Its lower edge was damp. I approached without touching the frame. Outside, the terrace lay beneath several inches of new snow. The library light spread across it in a muted yellow rectangle. Beyond that, the night was white and indistinct, the pine trees reduced to dark vertical shapes behind the moving fall. Directly below the window, the snow had been disturbed. A line of footprints crossed the terrace toward the rear of the inn. Their edges had softened beneath fresh flakes, but their course remained clear. The impressions were broad and regular, made by heavy overshoes rather than ordinary shoes. Dr. Lennox stood behind me. Someone left through the window. Someone traveled from it. Is there a difference? There may be. I took the lamp from the desk and held it nearer the opening. The tracks moved away from the library, each print pointing toward the service yard. I followed them with my eyes until they passed beyond the reach of the light. Then I examined the snow on the other side of the window. The smooth white surface extended unbroken toward the trees and the outer grounds. No prints crossed it. No line approached the library from the road, the forest, or any other part of the terrace. The only footprints began directly beneath the open casement. Dr. Lennox remained beside the open casement while I returned the lamp to the desk. The tracks must be examined before the snow covers them, I said. I shall remain with Haldane. Lock the door after me. Admit no one unless I return. She gave a brief nod. In the east passage, Callum was waiting with Mrs. Macri and Angus. The others had been persuaded back to the drawing room, though Major Fenwick had evidently required more persuasion than Isabel. I need a lantern, I said, and someone who knows the rear of the inn. I do, Callum replied. So does Angus, said Mrs. Macri. Callum looked at her. There is no reason for you to come outside. I had not proposed to. Her tone was mild, but it carried the small authority with which she had governed Raven's Rest through more winters than either man had seen. Angus fetched 2 storm lanterns from a cupboard beyond the bay's door. While he lit them, Mrs. Kaya appeared at the end of the kitchen passage, carrying a covered earthenware dish. She was a broad, capable woman with iron-grey hair and flour upon one sleeve. The scent of warm oatcakes came with her. I have put these near the range, she told Mrs. Macri. There is broth still hot, and I shall keep it so. No one may wish to eat. Then it will do no harm waiting. Mrs. Kayers gazed past over Callum, Angus, and me. She did not ask what had occurred in the library. News had plainly traveled through the service rooms without acquiring the vulgarity of gossip. The kitchen fire will be kept up, she added. Mary has taken blankets to the drawing room. Thank you, Mrs. Macri said. The cook withdrew, leaving behind the homely smell of toasted oats and the low simmer of something upon the range. It was a curious comfort. Raven's Rest seemed determined that whatever else happened beneath its roof, no guest should face it cold or hungry. Angus handed me a lantern. The east terrace can be reached from the yard, he said. We need not disturb the library window. We passed through the rear corridor. The service door stood beneath a shallow stone arch. Its inner face was painted dark green and fitted with a heavy iron latch above the lock. A drift pressed against the outer threshold, its pale ridge visible where the door failed to meet the stone perfectly. Callum took the long, square-ended key from his ring. This is the working key, he said. The lock catches when the metal contracts. It must be turned firmly. He inserted it and twisted. The mechanism resisted, then yielded with a blunt metallic sound. When was this door last opened? I asked. Before dinner. Angus brought in coal shortly after 7. And afterward. I checked it when you arrived, Callum said. Then again, after the telephone failed. From inside. Yes. Did you open it? No. I tested the latch. Angus lifted the lantern higher. I heard it later. Callum turned toward him. Heard what? The latch. Sometime after the coffee went into the drawing room. At 9:30. Near enough. Why did you say nothing? Angus's expression remained steady. Because a door latch in a storm is not generally regarded as evidence of murder. Callum looked away. I examined the lock without touching it unnecessarily. There was no bolt which could have been drawn from outside, only the key mechanism and the inner latch. The door had been locked when we reached it. You are certain? I asked Angus. Lies. I tried the handle after Miss Reed called for the doctor. It did not move. Callum frowned. Why did you try it? To see whether anyone had come in from the yard. A sensible precaution taken before he understood what it might imply. I asked Callum to open the door. Wind pressed cold air into the corridor the instant the latch was lifted. Snow swept across the threshold in a fine powder and melted upon the flags. Beyond lay the kitchen yard, enclosed on 2 sides by the rear walls of the inn and on the third by a low stone wall. Coal sheds and a covered store stood to the west. To the east, the ground narrowed toward the terrace and pine trees. We stepped outside. Angus closed the door behind us, but did not lock it. The lantern light revealed the trail almost immediately. The broad impressions came around the eastern corner of the building and crossed the final stretch of yard in a direct line toward the service door. The last print lay close to the threshold, partly protected by the stone arch. I crouched beside it. A small raven was molded into the heel. Callum saw it. The inn overshoes. So it would appear. They are kept in the vestibule. I noticed. We followed the tracks backward along the wall. Snow reached nearly to the tops of my shoes, though the prints themselves remained distinct beneath the eaves. Farther out, fresh flakes had begun to soften their edges. The trail curved around the eastern corner and continued across the terrace to the library window. There were no branches from it, no second line of prints, and no indication that anyone had approached from the trees. The trackmaker had crossed one way only, from the library to the service door. Angus held the lantern toward the forest. The snowfall reduced the pines to a succession of dark columns, each fading behind the next. No man came from there, he said. No. Then whoever made these was already inside. Callum spoke quickly. Unless he reached the library by some other part of the house, and then chose to advertise his departure. His mouth closed. We returned to the yard and entered the inn. The corridor warmth enveloped us at once. Mrs. Macri waited where we had left her, though Mary had brought a woolen shawl and placed it around her shoulders. Well, she asked. The tracks lead from the library to this door, I said. They do not lead toward the library from anywhere outside. She looked at Callum's key ring. The spare is still in my office. I should like to see it. We crossed the hall. The drawing room door stood partly open. Within, Mary moved quietly among the guests, placing cups of broth upon small trays. The Major had accepted his with both hands. Isabel sat nearest the fire, beneath one of the extra blankets, her notebook closed upon her lap. The grandfather clock struck 11. Its notes seemed unusually slow. Mrs. Macri opened the office and switched on the desk lamp. The shallow key press hung where I had first seen it. The glass door was closed. She unlocked it with a smaller key from her own chain. The square brass spare remained upon its red cord beneath the label rear service door. Dust lay unbroken along the narrow lower edge of the press. When was this last removed? I asked. 3 weeks ago, when Callum misplaced his ring for an hour. I had left it in the cellar, Callum said. Mrs. Macri lifted the spare, but did not detach it from the cord. The cord is knotted through the bow. It could not be used without taking the key down. The red fibers showed no recent strain. I asked Angus to bring the overshoes from the vestibule. He returned carrying 2 pairs and placed them upon a sheet of newspaper in the office. Their soles were wet with melted snow and road dirt from the guests' arrival, but one pair differed from the others. Packed beneath the outer buckle of the right overshoe was a small ridge of clean, fresh snow. The raven mark on its heel matched the impressions outside. These were not standing together earlier, Angus said. What do you mean? The smaller pair belonged on the left. These were beside them when I came through after the body was found. Could someone have moved them? Major Fenwick's recent visit to the vestibule came at once to mind. Possibly. Callum bent to examine the overshoe, then straightened without touching it. Guests move them constantly. In weather such as this, they may have searched for their own boots. Did you? No. The damp line remained visible above his right shoe. You told Angus that came from the vestibule mat. It did. Yet the mat lies several feet from the overshoe rack. Callum's eyes met mine. I did not measure the distance. No. Most men do not, until distance becomes important. Mrs. Macri looked from him to me, but said nothing. I returned the overshoes to the newspaper and considered the facts in their quiet order. The footprints began beneath the library window. They ended at a door which had afterwards been locked from within. The prints had been made by footwear belonging to Raven's Rest. The spare key had not been removed. Callum possessed the working key. There was no hidden traveler among the pines, no stranger wandering the white grounds, and no unknown figure who had approached the library through the storm. Whatever else remained uncertain, one conclusion had become clear. Raven's Rest contained no intruder. It contained someone who wished us to believe there had been one. Mrs. Macri remained in the office after Angus had carried the overshoes back to the vestibule. He did not return them immediately to the rack. At my request, he spread fresh newspaper beneath a bench and set the 4 damp pairs upon it to dry. Mary appeared with an old towel and began wiping the melted snow from the stone floor before it could be carried into the hall. "Leave the buckles as they are," I said. She withdrew her hand at once. "I was only meaning to prevent the rust, sir." "So you shall later." Mrs. Macri looked toward the open office door. "They will stain the newspaper. Newspapers have survived worse uses." This seemed to satisfy her. Even now, with a dead man in the library and suspicion moving invisibly through the inn, she could not quite surrender concern for its flaws, fittings, and borrowed footwear. Callum offered to remain. "I should like to speak with your aunt alone," I said. His gaze moved to Mrs. Macri. "I have nothing to conceal from him," she said. The words were directed toward Callum, though their firmness seemed intended for herself. He left us and crossed the hall to the drawing room. Angus closed the office door behind him. The desk lamp threw a calm circle of light across the account books and pigeonholes. Outside the small window, snow pressed against the glass in feathery ridges. The storm had lost some of its wind, but the fall remained thick and steady. Mrs. Macri sat at the roll-top desk. "You wish to ask about the letter?" "Yes." She folded her hands upon the blotter. "Mr. Haldane's letter informed me that unless certain arrears were settled, his firm would recommend proceedings against Raven's Rest. Foreclosure." He did not use the word in the first paragraph, but he reached it eventually. He generally did. Her composure did not break. It settled more heavily around her. "How serious is the position?" "Serious enough that I had hoped to discuss it with him privately tomorrow. Not serious enough to justify the pleasure he took in delivering it before my guests." "You burned the letter?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I had read it." The answer was so simple that I waited. Mrs. Macri looked toward the office fire, which had not been lit. "I carried it to the drawing room. Callum was watching me. I did not want him to see the terms before I had decided what to tell him. I held it over the fire and let it burn. There may be those who regard the destruction of a threatening letter on the night its writer was murdered as unfortunate. I considered that. Before or after you burned it?" "After." A trace of tired humor softened her face. "Most wisdom arrives at that stage." "What time did you leave the drawing room?" "A little before 9. "And where did you go?" "To the kitchen passage first. Mrs. Kaya wished to know whether breakfast should be delayed if the storm continued. Then I came here." "What did you do in the office?" "I examined the mortgage correspondence. I wanted to know whether Haldane had overstated his authority." "Did he?" "No." The single syllable held no self-pity. "Who saw you?" "Mrs. Kaya saw me in the passage. Mary brought the booking book here at approximately 20 minutes past 9. Angus asked for the second cellar key shortly afterward. And the spare service door key." She turned toward the glazed press. It remained where you found it. You did not remove it. No. Did anyone enter the office while you were absent? The door was locked. I carried the key. I glanced at the account books beneath the window. How closely do you supervise those? Not as closely as I once did. Callum prepares them. The detailed monthly entries, yes. I examine the balances and sign the annual papers. Did Haldane object to that arrangement? He encouraged it. He said Callum should be given responsibility if he was to manage the inn properly. She looked down at her folded hands. I believed he was right. There was no accusation in the words, only the first quiet movement of doubt. I did not press it yet. When we returned to the drawing room, Mary was removing the coffee things. In their place, she had set a brown earthenware pot of tea, cups of thicker china, and a plate of Mrs. Kaya's oatcakes beneath a folded napkin. Near the hearth, a wooden clothes horse had appeared. Upon it hung our damp scarves and gloves from the examination of the yard. Mrs. Kaya had evidently decided that wet wool presented a more immediate danger than murder. She stood beside Angus, inspecting my boots. "You have snow beneath the welts," she said. I had noticed. It will soften the leather. I had not considered the consequences so grave. They are when good boots are concerned. She directed Angus to place them nearer the kitchen passage when I had finished with them, though not so near the range that they cracked. Then she returned downstairs, satisfied that at least one emergency had been brought under control. Major Fenwick sat alone at the card table. Callum had gone to remain near the library, and Dr. Lennox was with Isabel. Mrs. Macri took her chair by the fire. I poured tea for her before crossing to the Major. He regarded the cup I placed before him. I would have preferred whiskey. I know. That is why you brought tea. It seemed kinder. He sighed. One distrusts kindness at this hour. The grandfather clock showed midnight. You went to the vestibule at approximately 25 minutes to 10, I said, to recover my cigarette case, which you did not use. I changed my mind. Before or after searching Mr. Haldane's overcoat. His eyes rose slowly to mine. Mrs. Macri made no movement, but the china cup ceased halfway to her lips. The Major looked toward the fire. I wondered when that would become inconvenient. What were you searching for? A paper. What paper? He rubbed one thumb along the rim of his cup. A promissory note. In Haldane's possession. Yes. For what amount? Enough. That is not an amount recognized by banks. Banks lack imagination. Mrs. Macri said quietly, "Hugh." He closed his eyes for a moment. £400. It was not a ruinous sum to every man. To Major Fenwick, it plainly was. Haldane had extended the term twice, he continued. He refused a third extension after dinner. I thought he might have placed the note in his coat, before going to the library. So you searched the pockets? Yes. Did you find it? No. Did you touch the overshoes? He hesitated. One pair stood before the coat rack. I moved it aside with my foot. One pair or more. I may have shifted another while replacing the first. The vestibule was dim. Did you notice that one pair was wet with fresh snow? I noticed that most of Raven's Rest appeared wet with fresh snow. Did you wear them? No. Did you leave the inn? Certainly not. His indignation was genuine, though it arrived rather late to be useful. I asked Isabel to bring the red dispatch case from the library. Dr. Lennox accompanied her, carrying the case herself. At my request, Isabel examined its contents. The note is here, she said after a moment. She withdrew a folded document and read the name without opening it. Major Hugh Fenwick. The major looked away. You see, he said, my expedition achieved nothing except to make me appear both dishonest and inefficient. Most secret expeditions do. His admission explained why the overshoes had been returned out of order. It did not explain the clean snow packed beneath the buckle, nor the footprints across the east terrace. Mrs. Macri rose and crossed to the fire. Hugh, you should have told me. My dear Alina, you have an inn to lose. I saw no reason to burden you with a debt of mine. And so you searched a dead man's coat. I did not know he was dead. The distinction was important, if not flattering. The hall clock began to strike 12. As the last note faded, Mrs. Macri remained standing before the hearth, looking not at Major Fenwick, but at the darkened doorway leading toward her office. Haldane asked for the principal ledger, she said, but I could not have explained the entries he meant to examine. I waited. Her voice lowered. For nearly 2 years, Callum alone has prepared the detailed monthly accounts. The words remained in the room after the clock had finished striking. For nearly 2 years, Callum alone had prepared the detailed monthly accounts. Mrs. Macri appeared to regret the admission the moment it had been made. Not because it was untrue, but because truth, once spoken aloud, may acquire consequences which private thought has managed to postpone. I asked Isabel whether she felt able to answer several questions. Yes, she said. Her face had recovered some color, though her reserve had become more deliberate. The red dispatch case rested upon the card table between us. I should prefer somewhere quieter, she added. Dr. Lennox rose. Miss Reed ought not to remain in this room under examination by half the household. The major looked injured. I had no intention of examining anyone. That is what makes your presence so distracting. Mrs. Macri suggested Isabel's room. We left the drawing room and crossed the hall together. Mary was ascending the staircase ahead of us with a folded stack of linen against one hip. She stopped upon the landing to allow us to pass. Mrs. Kaya says the kitchen range will stay lit until morning, she told Mrs. Macri. And Angus has put the snow shovel inside the rear passage, so it will not freeze beneath the drift. Has the East Corridor fire been checked? Yes, ma'am. I have brought another coal hod. Even at midnight, Raven's Rest was being prepared for the next hour. Damp towels were replaced. Fires were measured against the cold. A shovel was rescued before the snow claimed it. These small acts required no discussion, yet together they kept the storm at a respectful distance. Mrs. Macri thanked her and returned downstairs. Isabel's room was near the head of the East Corridor, beside Haldane's. Mary had already drawn the curtains and placed a second hot water bottle beneath the coverlet. A shaded lamp burned upon the dressing table. Its light warmed the floral paper and the polished mahogany wardrobe, while the window remained a dark square behind the curtains. The pipes beneath the washstand gave a low knock, followed by a gentle rush of hot water somewhere within the walls. Isabel placed the red case upon a small writing desk. Dr. Lennox sat near the fire. I remained standing until Isabel had taken the chair opposite me. When I asked you about the contents of Mr. Haldane's case, I said, you hesitated. Yes. Why? She looked at the brass lock. Because something had been removed. Before or after his death. After I discovered him. Dr. Lennox's expression sharpened. You returned to the desk. I was already beside it. What did you remove? I asked. Isabel opened the case. The papers inside were arranged in narrow compartments, letters tied with tape, several legal drafts, a bank envelope, and a black shorthand notebook. One space near the back remained empty. Isabel reached beneath the writing desk and withdrew a flat blue folder. I took this. She laid it before me. Why conceal it? Because it does not concern his death. That is a conclusion rather than an explanation. Her hands settled upon her lap. Mr. Haldane's firm represented several elderly clients whose estates were modest and whose understanding of legal charges was more modest still. He increased fees, prolonged correspondence, and sometimes threatened proceedings which he had no intention of beginning. You copied the papers? Yes. For what purpose? To place them before another solicitor. Without Haldane's knowledge. He would hardly have approved. There was no triumph in her voice, only weariness. I opened the folder. The contents supported her account, copied letters, statements of charges, and memoranda bearing Haldane's firm heading. They revealed a pattern of pressure and excessive fees, but nothing directly connected with Raven's Rest. You feared he would discover the copies. He had begun asking why certain files appeared disturbed. And tonight, I believed he might dismiss me before I could take the evidence away. When I found him dead, the folder was visible beneath the other papers. I thought. She stopped. That suspicion would fall upon you. Yes. So you provided it with a reason. A faint color rose in her face. I see that now. Dr. Lennox leaned toward the fire. Fear rarely improves judgment. It merely makes it quicker. Isabel looked at her. Did you hate him, Doctor? The question was quiet but direct. Dr. Lennox did not object to it. My husband placed his financial affairs in Haldane's hands during a long illness. Malcolm persuaded him to sign papers which transferred control of certain investments. By the time I understood what had occurred, my husband was dead and the arrangements were difficult to challenge. Did Haldane profit? Indirectly. His firm retained management of the estate. And tonight you quarreled about it. We spoke of it. Dr. Lennox rose and crossed to the mantel, where a small traveling case had been placed beside her gloves. You will wish to see this as well. She opened it. Inside were bandages, a thermometer, several folded packets, 2 brown medicine bottles, and a small blue glass vial. Major Fenwick observed the case at dinner, she said. I suspect he has already furnished it with several imaginary poisons. What does the blue vial contain? Aconite liniment, for external use. And the powders, phenacetin and caffeine for headaches. One of them was the reason I went upstairs before Miss Reed found Haldane. Could anything here have killed him? Several things could kill a man if administered improperly. None killed Malcolm. She spoke with the unadorned certainty of her profession. The wound behind his ear was sufficient. There was no sign of convulsion, respiratory distress, or the other indications which would have made poisoning likely. He was struck by a hard, heavy object. Whatever else may be found in this room or in my case, that remains the cause of death. Did you supply Mrs. Macri with sleeping tablets? Dr. Lennox regarded me closely. Yes, twice this winter. Were they entered in your records? No. Why not? Because Elena is my friend, and because I gave her 6 tablets from my own supply when worry had kept her awake for several nights. Haldane knew. He suspected. He enjoyed possessing information whose importance depended upon the anxiety it produced. She closed the case. If you intend to ask whether I killed him to prevent disclosure, the answer is no. I had intended to ask whether he threatened you with it. He mentioned that professional standards are easily questioned. I told him moral standards are questioned more frequently, but seldom by solicitors. The faintest movement touched Isabel's mouth. Dr. Lennox returned to her chair. With the blue folder explained and the medical suggestion reduced to its proper proportions, I turned again to the red case. You delivered this to the library at 20 minutes past 9. Yes. What was inside then? The same papers, including the blue folder and Mr. Haldane's shorthand notebook. Did he ask for anything in particular? A memorandum concerning the Raven's rest accounts. Is it still here? She searched the compartments. No. Could it have been removed with the blue folder? I do not think so. She opened the black notebook. Haldane's handwriting occupied several pages in dense shorthand, interrupted by columns of figures and occasional ordinary initials. Were these notes made before tonight? Some in Edinburgh, others during dinner and after our arrival. You recorded his remarks at dinner. In my own notebook. He later copied what he considered relevant. She turned several pages and stopped. Here. The entry began with a date and the initials CM. Beneath them were several figures, followed by an abbreviated phrase. What does it say? Isabel read slowly. CM, winter expenditure inconsistent. Remittance absent. Guarantee to be examined. Anything concerning the meeting. She followed the next line with one finger. Ledger after dinner. Page. The shorthand ended where the pencil had torn faintly across the paper, as though Haldane's hand had been interrupted. Isabel moved nearer the lamp. There is another line beneath it. For several seconds, the only sound was the low movement of water through the pipes and the faint brushing of snow against the curtained window. Then she translated the unfinished entry. Page 47, signature not hers. Isabel's translation gave shape to several separate facts, though it did not yet arrange them. I closed Haldane's notebook and asked her to bring it downstairs with the red case. Dr. Lennox remained in her room. She had done what was required of her, and there was no reason to draw her through a further examination of accounts in which she possessed neither interest nor expertise. The east corridor had grown colder. Mary was moving from door to door with a covered brass warming pan, drawing it briefly between the sheets of each unoccupied bed before replacing the turned covers. She stood aside as we passed, the faint scent of heated lavender rising from the pan. Mrs. Macri is in the office, she said. Angus has brought up the old invoice boxes. Below us, the inn had become very quiet. The drawing room door was closed, though a narrow line of firelight showed beneath it. The grandfather clock marked 20 minutes past 1 with a single mellow note. Mrs. Macri sat at the office desk with the principal ledger before her. Angus had placed 2 wooden document boxes upon the floor. Their brass corners were tarnished, and their labels, coal, provisions, IPARS, had been written in different inks over several years. I keep the older records below, Mrs. Macri said. The office has never been large enough for its own history. Where below? In the bottle store, beside the wine cellar. It is dry there. She looked toward Isabel. Did you find what you required? Mr. Haldane made a note concerning page 47. Mrs. Macri opened the ledger. The pages were ruled in red and blue, with receipts entered on the left and expenditures upon the right. Callum's hand was small and orderly, its figures formed with almost mechanical consistency. Page 46 ended with a balance carried forward. The next visible page was numbered 48. Between them remained the narrow, ragged edge of a leaf cut close to the binding. Mrs. Macri touched it with one finger. This was not missing yesterday. You are certain? I examined the annual totals before Mr. Haldane arrived. I did not read every entry, but I should have noticed a removed page. Isabel placed Haldane's notebook beside the ledger. He expected to examine it. Yes. And Callum carried the book to him. Mrs. Macri withdrew her hand. Neither of us said what followed naturally from those facts. I lowered the desk lamp until its light traveled almost level across page 48. The paper was thick, but pressure from writing upon the removed sheet had left shallow impressions beneath. At first, they appeared as little more than irregular lines. When the lamp was moved farther to one side, several figures emerged in faint relief. Isabel leaned closer. "There is an 8. And a 5, Mrs. Macri said. The impressions were incomplete, crossed by the writing properly entered upon page 48. I placed a thin sheet of office paper over the page and passed the side of a soft pencil lightly across it. Darkened ridges appeared where the buried pressure resisted the graphite. Not every mark could be read, but enough remained. Several payments had been entered against repairs to the western roof. Others appeared under coal, provisions, and replacement linen. Beside them stood repeated initials. CM. At the bottom of the missing page, the pressure had been heavier. A total could be distinguished with reasonable confidence. 1,850 pounds. Mrs. Macri sat very still. That cannot be right. You do not recognize the amount. No. The roof cost less than 700 pounds, and much of it was paid directly from the mortgage reserve. Who authorized the remaining withdrawals? Callum prepared the vouchers. I signed the quarterly statements. Did you examine the supporting invoices? Not always. Her honesty cost her something. He would bring the totals after dinner when the guests had settled. There was always some small matter requiring attention: a boiler, a delivery, a member of staff with a family difficulty. I trusted him. Trust is frequently described as blindness. It is not. Blindness cannot choose what it refuses to see. Angus stood near the door, his cap turning slowly between his hands. Shall I bring the repair invoices, ma'am? Yes, Mrs. Macri said. All of them. The bottle store lay below the lounge bar, reached by a narrow stone stair. I accompanied Angus, while Mrs. Macri and Isabel remained with the ledger. The cellar air was cool and dry. Racks of wine bottles extended beneath low arches, their labels chalked carefully upon wooden tags. Beyond them stood shelves of preserves, sacks of flour, and boxes of old papers raised from the floor upon narrow boards. A small furnace in the adjoining chamber sent a muted warmth through the wall. Angus lifted his lantern. Mrs. Kaya has set the breakfast bread to rise beside the range, he said as he searched the labels. She says the household may not wish for breakfast, but morning will come whether it is wanted or not. She is probably correct. She usually arranges matters so that correction becomes unnecessary. He selected 3 boxes and gave me the lightest. Near the stair stood a row of polished boots and shoes, stuffed with paper and placed to dry. My own pair had been set at the far end, well away from the furnace, in exact accordance with Mrs. Kaya's earlier instructions. The sight of them was oddly reassuring. Someone had found time, amid death and suspicion, to preserve the shape of a guest's boots. We carried the boxes upstairs. The invoices confirmed what the ledger impressions had suggested. Several bills entered upon the missing page did not exist. Others had been altered in the monthly summaries. A supplier in Inverness had apparently been paid twice for the same shipment of coal. Roof repairs had been increased by more than £200. 3 remittances intended for the mortgage account had never reached it. Isabel opened Haldane's red case and removed a bank envelope. This may be the memorandum he intended to use. Inside was a copy of a guarantee bearing Elena Macri's signature beneath a sum of £1,200. Mrs. Macri took it. I did not sign this. You are certain? I asked. She looked at me with quiet astonishment. I have signed my own name for more than 50 years. The signature was a competent imitation. Its general form was correct, but the initial E leaned too far forward, and the final stroke of Macri ended in a narrow upward hook. Mrs. Macri signed a blank sheet beneath it. Her hand produced the same broad letters, but the final stroke descended firmly and stopped. Isabel turned to Haldane's shorthand notes. The signature not hers, she repeated. He had already compared it. The bank papers showed that the guarantee had secured a loan paid into an account used for the inn's operating expenses. Several later withdrawals corresponded with the false entries upon page 47. Could anyone else have prepared these accounts? I asked. Mrs. Macri shook her head. Not in this form. Angus keeps the bar book. Mrs. Kaya records kitchen purchases. I sign the larger checks. But Callum brings everything together at the end of each month. Did he have access to your correspondence and signature? Yes. Her voice had grown softer. He has had access to everything. Snow touched the office window in a gentle, dry whisper. Somewhere in the kitchen passage, a clock chimed twice, less resonant than the great clock in the hall. A door opened and closed below. Then came the faint sound of a poker settling coal upon the range. The inn continued to breathe around us. I returned to the principal ledger. The cut edge showed that page 47 had been removed with a knife rather than torn. The charred fragment recovered from the library grate bore the same printed number. Its paper matched the ledger in weight and ruling. Someone had taken the page from the book after it reached the library and attempted to burn it in Haldane's fire. The act had concealed very little. It had instead revealed precisely which page mattered. Mrs. Macri remained beside the desk, one hand resting near the forged signature without touching it. Callum told me the money was tight, she said. He said every young business passed through difficult seasons. Raven's Rest is not a young business. No, but he wished to make it his own. There was affection in the words still, though it had become inseparable from pain. Isabel gathered the documents into a careful order. Haldane meant to confront him with this tonight. Yes, and afterward. He intended dictation, I said. Most likely a formal record of what had been admitted or denied. The missing funds provided motive. The destroyed page connected that motive to the library. The meeting provided opportunity. Yet motive, opportunity, and a lie are not always murder. A complete case requires the point at which argument becomes physical fact. I looked again at the forged signature, then at the faint impressions left by the missing page. In memory, I saw Haldane's contracted fingers upon the carpet, and the small curved object we had removed from his hand, pale beneath its dark smear, with a fragment of silver fastening still attached. I closed the ledger. "Mrs. Macri," I said, "I should like to see Callum's remaining cufflink." Callum was not in the drawing room when we left the office. Major Fenwick had fallen into a shallow sleep beside the fire, one hand resting upon the closed book in his lap. Isabel occupied the smaller sofa beneath the window, though she was not reading. Dr. Lennox sat opposite her with a cup of tea balanced upon one knee. Mrs. Macri looked around the room. "Where is Callum?" "Near the library," Dr. Lennox said. "He wished to make certain no one entered. He was told that the room was secured. He appears to have found obedience difficult tonight." Mrs. Macri drew her shawl more closely about her shoulders. "I shall fetch him." "Allow Angus to do so," I said. "I should like a few minutes first." She regarded me in silence, then nodded. Angus went along the east passage. The hall had acquired the peculiar stillness of a house awake beyond its customary hour. The lamps burned lower. Shadows lay beneath the staircase, and the grandfather clock seemed to occupy more space than it had before midnight. Its pendulum moved with solemn regularity behind the glass. Mary crossed the landing above us, carrying an armful of folded towels. She paused to adjust one which had begun to slip, then disappeared into the west corridor. From somewhere beyond the baize door came the quiet scrape of a shovel against stone. The drift at the rear entrance was being kept from the threshold, though no one expected the door to open before daylight. I stood alone beside the reception desk. The scent of cooling peat smoke drifted from the drawing room. Snow touched the high windows in soft, intermittent grains. Raven's Rest had settled around the investigation without surrendering to it. Fires were banked, linen folded, steps cleared, and clocks wound. The household did not deny that death had entered. It merely refused to permit death to become the only fact beneath its roof. Upon the desk before me lay the envelope containing the fragment taken from Haldane's hand. I opened it. The object appeared less obscure beneath the hall lamp. One face was smooth and pale, the grain faintly visible beneath the stain. The curved outer surface bore two shallow cuts, arranged like the lower leaves of a thistle. At one end remained part of a narrow silver fitting, snapped sharply through its hinge. I had seen its companion throughout dinner. There are moments in an inquiry when the evidence does not suddenly assemble itself. It has already been assembled. One merely ceases to insist upon looking at each piece separately. The cufflink placed Callum within Haldane's reach during a physical struggle. The ledger supplied the reason for that struggle. The open window and service route showed what had followed it. Yet there remained value in testing a conclusion before allowing it to harden. A man may fit the facts because the facts are true, or because one has unconsciously chosen only those which fit the man. Angus returned with Callum. He had put on the brown cardigan he had worn at my arrival. His right shirt cuff was buttoned. The left still bore the carved antler fastening. "You wish to see me?" he asked. "In the lounge bar, if you please." The bar adjoined the drawing room, but could be entered from the hall. its polished counter curved beneath shelves of bottles and hanging glasses. Only one lamp had been left alight. Angus went behind the counter and placed a small pot of coffee upon a spirit warmer. "Mrs. Ngaio made it fresh," he said. "She says tea is no longer equal to the hour." Callum remained standing. I indicated a chair. He sat without removing his cardigan. "Your right cufflink is missing," I said. His gaze dropped briefly to his wrist. "Yes. When did you lose it?" "This afternoon. Before dinner." "I believe so." "When?" "I do not know." "Yet at dinner you wore both." He looked at me again. "I think you are mistaken." Mary had entered quietly with a tray of clean glasses. At the sound of her name, she stopped. "You assisted Mr. Macri before dinner?" I asked. "Yes, sir." His jacket had caught a little ash from the hall fire, and I brushed it. "Were both cufflinks present?" She looked at Callum, not fearfully, but with the natural reluctance of a servant required to contradict the manager of the inn. "Yes, sir." "You are certain?" "The right one came loose when he put on the jacket. I fastened it again." Callum's fingers tightened upon the arm of the chair. "That may have been earlier." "It was after 7, Mr. Macri." Mary set down the tray. I remember because Mrs. Ngaio had already sent up the hot plates. "Thank you," I said. She withdrew, closing the door softly behind her. I placed the fragment from the envelope upon the polished bar. Callum did not touch it. The broken antler fitted the carving of his remaining cufflink exactly. The grain continued across the break, and the snapped silver hinge corresponded with the empty fastening at his right wrist. "You recognize it," I said. "It resembles mine." "It is yours." He looked toward Angus. "Where was it found?" "In Malcolm Haldane's hand." The warmth of the bar seemed to recede by a degree. Callum's face did not change, though his breath became shallower. He must have caught it during our discussion. "You told us the meeting was calm." "It was difficult, not violent." "You also said Haldane was alive and working when you left." "He was." "Did he seize your sleeve?" Callum hesitated. He reached for me when I attempted to take back the ledger. "Why did you not mention that?" "It did not seem important." A broken cufflink found in a murdered man's hand seldom suffers from insignificance. He rose abruptly. "This proves only that we argued." "It proves that your account of the argument was false." He moved toward the counter, then stopped. I was ashamed of the scene. Haldane accused me of theft. I tried to take the ledger. He caught my cuff. That was all. And then I left. Through the library door. Yes. Directly to the drawing room. Yes. Angus poured coffee into 3 cups. His movements remained slow and exact, though he had ceased to look at either of us. "You were seen entering the drawing room at 2 minutes past 9:30, I said. Isabel left you with Haldane at 20 minutes past. 12 minutes is sufficient for more than an argument. It is also sufficient for an argument. And for removing page 47. His expression hardened. I know nothing about the missing page, or the forged guarantee. A silence followed. The coffee made a small sound upon the spirit warmer. Callum said, "My aunt has shown you the accounts." "She has." "She does not understand what was necessary to keep this place open." "That is a different question from whether you forged her signature." "I used the money for Raven's Rest." "Some of it, perhaps." His head lifted. "All of it." The answer came too quickly. I did not pursue it. Instead, I asked Angus to bring the manager's key ring from the small table where Callum had placed it. The long square-ended service key hung among the others. "You carried this throughout the evening?" "Yes." "No one borrowed it?" "No." You heard Angus say that the rear latch moved shortly after 9:30. The wind may have shaken it. The door was locked afterward. It is a temperamental lock. A temperamental lock does not turn its own key. Callum looked toward the dark window behind the bar. The tracks proved someone crossed the terrace. They proved that someone left the library window and entered through the service door. Then another person had a key. The spare remained secured. Someone may have copied it during a snowstorm in an isolated inn for the purpose of murdering Haldane with an object already in the library. His silence answered more effectively than words. I asked him to stand. The damp mark upon his right trouser cuff had dried to a pale tide line. Fine grains of grit remained in the cloth where melted snow had carried them upward. You said this came from the vestibule mat. It did. The mat was damp with road slush and dark soil. The snow beneath the overshoe buckle was clean. I did not wear the overshoes. Then you will have no objection to the route being tested. We crossed the hall to the library. Dr. Lennox unlocked the door and admitted us. The body had been covered with a clean linen sheet, leaving the surrounding carpet undisturbed. A fresh log had not been added to the fire. Only a red hollow remained beneath the grate. Callum stood near the threshold. I measured the distance from the desk to the window, then from the library door through the connecting passages to the drawing room. Angus timed the walk with Haldane's mantle clock. A direct return through the hall required less than a minute. The exterior route from the window to the service door, even allowing for the snow, could be completed in under 3. There had been ample time to strike Haldane, burn the page, wipe the weapon, create the trail, return through the service corridor, and enter the drawing room after Angus. Callum watched without comment. I went to the bookcase and examined the bronze ravens beneath the stronger light of Dr. Lennox's torch. The forward bookend bore a slight indentation beside its beak. Dr. Lennox compared its edge with the wound as closely as circumstances allowed. The dimensions agree, she said. Within the carved feathers, the dark residue remained where the cloth had failed to reach. The shifted baize pad beneath the base had collected a single short grey hair. Callum turned away. I replaced nothing, for nothing had been moved. The room, the snow, and the dead man's hand had each preserved a different portion of the same account. Still, accusation belonged not to a corridor, a bar, or a room containing only those who already understood. I returned to the hall, where Mrs. Macri waited beneath the clock. Its hands stood a little after 3. "Elena," I said, "please gather everyone in the drawing room." She searched my face. "You know what happened?" "Yes." Her eyes moved past me to Callum, who had stopped beneath the East Passage lamp. For one moment, she seemed much older than she had at dinner. Then the innkeeper's composure returned. "I shall wake the Major," she said, "and ask Mary to bring fresh tea. That would be wise." She turned towards the drawing room door. "The murder can now be explained." By the time we entered the drawing room, Mary had set a fresh tray upon the low table. The teapot was covered by a knitted cozy of dark green wool. Clean cups stood in a half circle beside it, and a plate of shortbread had been brought from the pantry, though no one appeared inclined to eat. Angus had stirred the fire and drawn the heavy curtains more closely across the windows. Snow whispered against them in small, dry movements. Major Fenwick sat upright now, his sleepiness replaced by apprehension. Isabel occupied the sofa nearest the lamp, the red dispatch case at her feet. Dr. Lennox stood behind her chair. Mrs. Macri remained beside the hearth. Callum took the place farthest from his aunt. The grandfather clock in the hall had recently struck the quarter. Its last vibration seemed still to hang in the quiet. I stood before the fire, not because I wished to command the room, but because it allowed me to see every face without turning. "There are 2 mysteries before us," I said. "The first is who killed Malcolm Haldane. The second is why anyone wished us to believe that a stranger had entered Raven's Rest." No one spoke. The second question must be answered first. I looked toward the curtained windows. The snow outside the library preserved a line of footprints. At first sight, those prints suggested that the murderer had escaped through the casement. But the snow showed only a journey away from the library. There were no footprints approaching it from the road, the forest, the terrace, or any other point outside. Major Fenwick shifted in his chair. So the man was already within the room. Or within the inn. "The tracks led to the service door," Dr. Lennox said. "Yes, and that door was afterward found locked from inside." Callum's face remained still. The trackmaker therefore climbed from the library window, crossed the terrace, unlocked the service door, and re-entered Raven's Rest. "Unless someone admitted him," Callum said. That possibility had to be considered. Yet no second trail approached the door, and Angus heard no exchange of voices. More importantly, the only spare key remained secured in Mrs. Macri's office. The working key was carried throughout the evening by one person. Mrs. Macri's gaze moved toward the key ring, now lying upon the table beside Callum. He said someone could have copied it. "Yes." An unknown visitor might have copied a winter service key, entered an isolated inn without leaving tracks, concealed himself until after dinner, murdered Haldane with a library ornament, burned an account page, borrowed the inn's overshoes, and departed by the most conspicuous route possible. The Major cleared his throat. When you put it in that order, it does lose something. The snow trail was not an escape, I said. It was a performance. I crossed to the vestibule doorway, where the overshoes remained upon newspaper beneath the bench. The prints were made by a pair belonging to Raven's Rest. Their raven-shaped heel mark was plainly visible. Snow remained packed beneath one buckle after the pair had been returned. Major Fenwick looked down. I moved them. You did. But later. He gave a reluctant nod. You entered the vestibule after Callum had returned to the drawing room. You searched Haldane's coat for your promissory note and disturbed the rack. That explained why the pairs stood out of order. It did not explain how fresh snow entered the buckle. Mrs. Macri spoke without looking at him. And the note was still in Haldane's case. Yes. The Major's deception had been shabby, but it had not been murderous. He accepted the distinction with visible relief and less visible shame. I turned to Mrs. Macri. You also concealed something. Haldane gave you notice that his firm might proceed against Raven's Rest. I burned it. You did. That act made you appear to have destroyed evidence, but the letter concerned foreclosure. Mrs. Kaya, Mary, and the office records account for your movements during the critical interval. The spare service key remained untouched. Mrs. Macri inclined her head. I looked at Isabel. Miss Reed removed a blue folder from the dispatch case after finding the body. It contained copies of correspondence showing Haldane's treatment of several clients. She feared the papers would be discovered before she could place them before another solicitor. Isabel's hands tightened around one another. I should have told you at once. Yes, but concealment born of fear is not proof of murder. Dr. Lennox's medicine case stood near her chair. Dr. Lennox carried substances which, administered improperly, might have caused death. Yet Haldane was not poisoned. He died from a single blow behind the right ear. Dr. Lennox said, made by a hard object with a narrow striking edge. The bronze raven bookend in the library bears a fresh mark beside its beak. It had been wiped, though a dark trace remained within the carved feathers. One baize pad had shifted, and a grey hair was caught beneath it. The fire settled with a faint inward sigh. No one looked toward Callum now. That deliberate avoidance was more eloquent than staring. Haldane was alive at 20 minutes past 9, I continued. Miss Reed saw him with Callum in the library. Callum returned to the drawing room at approximately 2 minutes past 9:30. 12 minutes, Isabel said. Enough time for the argument, he admitted. Enough time also for the blow, the destruction of a ledger page, the wiping of the weapon, and the journey through the snow. Callum rose. You have proved that I argued with him. Nothing more. I have not finished. He remained standing. Haldane's notes referred to page 47 and to a signature which was not Mrs. Macri's. Page 47 had been cut from the principal ledger. A charred, numbered fragment survived behind the library grate. Pressure marks on the following page preserved false entries and a total of £1,850. Mrs. Macri closed her eyes briefly. The guarantee bearing her name was forged, I said. The missing remittances, altered invoices, and false repair charges were all contained within accounts prepared by Callum. I used the money for the ends. His voice was controlled, but the control had become effort. That explains the fraud. It does not excuse it. Haldane meant to ruin this place. He meant to expose you. Callum's hand closed over the back of his chair. He would have taken Raven's rest from her. You had already placed it in danger. Mrs. Macri did not rebuke him. Her silence held more pain than anger could have managed. I took the envelope from my pocket. When Haldane fell, one hand closed upon something broken. The fragment of antler and silver lay small upon my palm. Callum stared at it. Mary saw both of your cufflinks intact before dinner. Isabel saw you with Haldane at 20 minutes past 9. After you returned, your right cuff was fastened only by its button. He caught my sleeve, Callum said. I told you. Only after the fragment was shown to you. Before that, you described the meeting as calm and denied any physical struggle. I wish to avoid scandal. A dead man's hand preserved the scandal. He looked toward the door. Anger stood beyond it, not barring the way, merely present. Outside the windows, the snow continued its patient descent. Callum sank slowly back into the chair. I placed the broken fragment upon the table beside the remaining cufflink. The grain continues across the break. The silver hinge matches. Haldane tore it free while attempting to defend himself. Callum said nothing. You struck him with the bronze raven. Afterward, you removed the page which contained the clearest record of the false accounts and tried to burn it. Then you opened the casement, put on the inn's overshoes, crossed to the service entrance, unlocked the door with your key, returned the overshoes, and entered the drawing room through the service passages. Angus spoke quietly. I heard the latch. Yes, the damp upon your trouser cuff came from the snow, not the vestibule mat, I said. The track, the key, the ledger, the weapon, the cufflink, and the timing all tell the same story. For some time, Callum watched the fire. When he spoke, his voice had lost its defensiveness. The roof was failing. Wages were due. Then the boiler went, and 3 winter parties cancelled within a fortnight. Mrs. Macri turned toward him. You should have told me. I thought I could replace it. With what? The spring bookings. Then the summer. There was always another season in which it might be repaired. And when there was not. He looked at her at last. I signed your name. The admission seemed to reduce him physically. Haldane knew, he continued. He showed me the guarantee. He said he would remove me from the accounts and place the matter before the police as soon as the road opened. So you killed him, Major Fenwick said. Callum shook his head once. I asked for time. He refused. He went toward the telephone, though the line was dead. He said he would make a written declaration while the matter was fresh. His gaze settled upon the carpet. I tried to take the ledger. He caught my cuff. I saw the raven upon the shelf. No one interrupted. I struck him once. The fire shifted behind the guard. Afterward, he said, I thought only of the page. Then the window. The snow seemed perfect. It would show that someone had gone. It showed exactly that, I said, but not that anyone had arrived. A tired, almost bitter smile touched his mouth. No. Mrs. Macri crossed the room. For one hopeful instant, Callum seemed to believe she might place a hand upon his shoulder. She stopped beyond his reach. Raven's Rest could have survived debt, she said quietly. It could have survived the shame of failure. He looked up at her. But not the lie you chose to protect. No one answered Mrs. Macri. There are words which end an argument because they leave nothing behind that can be defended. Callum lowered his head, and the room settled into the quiet which follows not surprise, but recognition. Dr. Lennox was the first to move. We must decide what is to be done until the road is opened. Her practical tone restored us to the hour and the circumstances. Beyond the curtains, the snow had softened to a steady, almost soundless fall. The wind no longer pressed against the windows with the violence of earlier in the night, though the world outside remained entirely white and inaccessible. Callum rose without resistance. I shall remain wherever you wish. The small morning room, Mrs. Macri said. It has no outer door, and Angus can stay nearby. Angus gave a grave nod. Callum looked once toward his aunt. She did not turn away, but neither did she go to him. He crossed the hall with Angus beside him. There was no struggle, no final protest, and no attempt to preserve what had already been lost. The morning room door closed quietly behind them. Major Fenwick remained near the fire. What happens when the road is passable? We inform the authorities, I said. The library remains secured. The papers and other evidence will be kept together. I shall make a full statement. So shall I, Isabel said. She sat with the red dispatch case at her feet, one hand resting upon its lid. Her face showed exhaustion, yet some portion of its habitual composure had returned. There are copies in the blue folder, she continued. Not merely of Haldane's treatment of his clients. Several letters concern the charges made against Raven's Rest. Mrs. Macri looked at her. Could they alter the position? They may justify an independent review. I cannot promise more. No, Mrs. Macri said. Promises have caused sufficient harm tonight. There was no bitterness in the reply. Only caution newly earned. Isabel inclined her head. I shall place everything before another solicitor. Major Fenwick cleared his throat. And my note. It remains part of Mr. Haldane's affairs, she said. But I see no reason it should be treated without ordinary discretion. The Major looked toward Mrs. Macri. I ought to have told you. Yes. I sold the medals last autumn. Her expression softened, though she did not spare him. They were yours to sell. They were my father's. Then perhaps you should have trusted your friends before trusting your pride. He accepted this in silence. Mary entered, carrying a fresh coal scuttle. She glanced toward the empty chair Callum had occupied, then lowered her eyes and crossed to the hearth. "Shall I build it up, ma'am?" Mrs. Macri looked at the fire. "Yes, we shall not all be going to bed at once." Mary knelt and arranged the coal with slow care. The black pieces settled among the embers, and after a little while a narrow flame appeared between them. Mrs. Kaya followed with a tray bearing tea, thick slices of bread, butter, and a small pot of marmalade. "No one has eaten since supper," she said. "I do not think," Mrs. Macri began. That was not a question. The cook placed the tray upon the table and began pouring tea. Her authority, founded upon years of breakfasts and illnesses, appeared immune to murder, insolvency, and human shame. Cups were handed around. Bread was accepted by those who had intended to refuse it. Even Dr. Lennox submitted without argument. Mrs. Kaya inspected the room, decided that we were sufficiently supplied, and went back toward the kitchen. A moment later came the muted sounds of her preparations. Crockery set upon a dresser, the range door opened, a wooden spoon against a mixing bowl. Morning had not arrived, but Raven's Rest was already making provision for it. Mrs. Macri sat beside Isabel. "Will you remain with me until the police come?" "Of course." Dr. Lennox said, "I shall remain as well." "You were meant to leave tomorrow." "I have revised my medical opinion." The ghost of a smile passed over Mrs. Macri's face. The grandfather clock struck 4. Its deep notes traveled through the hall and into the drawing room, each one separated by a breadth of silence. No light showed beyond the curtains. The night remained intact. When the last note faded, I left the others beside the fire and stepped into the hall. The lamps had been turned low. Folded blankets rested upon a chair near the staircase. Our gloves and scarves still hung from the clothes horse, dry now and faintly scented with peat smoke. Somewhere above, a pipe clicked as the hot water moved through the walls. Raven's Rest had endured a murder, a confession, and the collapse of several carefully maintained deceptions. Yet the inn had not ceased to be itself. Its strength lay less in stone and timber than in the quiet responsibilities accepted by those who cared for it. A fire was tended because someone might be cold. Bread was set to rise because hunger would return. Snow was cleared from a threshold even when no door could yet be opened. Callum had mistaken possession for responsibility. He had believed that protecting the inn meant preserving it at any cost, even from the truth. Mrs. Macri had understood something simpler and more difficult, that a place survives through the trust placed within it, and that trust cannot be repaired by concealment. I remained beneath the clock until its pendulum had made several slow journeys. Then I returned to the drawing room. The tea had grown weaker, but no one seemed to mind. Major Fenwick was spreading butter upon a second piece of bread. Isabel had begun arranging Haldane's papers into labeled groups. Dr. Lennox had placed another log beside the fire, ready for later. Mrs. Macri looked up as I entered. "You should rest." So should you. I shall when the house is settled. It was the answer of an innkeeper, and argument would have been discourteous. I took my leave and climbed the stairs. Mary had already turned back the coverlet in my room. The hot water bottle beneath the blankets still held some warmth. Upon the desk stood a fresh jug of water and a small covered plate containing 2 oatcakes which I had no memory of requesting. The fire had burned low but evenly. I undressed, drew the curtains apart by an inch, and looked outside. The roads remained hidden. The pines stood quietly beneath their burden. Snow moved past the window in smaller flakes now, descending without haste into the darkness. I extinguished the lamp and lay down. Behind the guard, the fire settled with a soft crimson glow. From far below came the faint closing of a cupboard, then the slow, familiar ticking of the grandfather clock. The last movement of snow brushed gently against the darkened glass, and Raven's Rest grew quiet around me.